It was traumatic because I couldn't believe it was happening. I couldn't believe that Alec was brought so low and there was such grave charges against him. I did not believe, I do not believe that Alec forced unwanted sexual attention on women. And I'm vindicated in that belief by the fact that the jury, a largely female jury, which heard all the evidence at his trial, acquitted him of all the charges. So it was really shocking for me. And I had stood by him and I knew I was putting my reputation on the line because if he had been convicted, it wouldn't have things wouldn't have looked so good for me. And so when Alec, these accusations started to surface against Alec, I made the decision to stand by him. And also, I'd seen what went on behind the scenes in the party, and I was suspicious that there was some effort to smear him and sideline him so he wouldn't make a comeback. But then that day, I went up the fire escape and I was told by him, just the two of us, what the charges were and how grave they were. I was appalled, I was shocked, and I'd never seen Alex so upset. And it was just so awful, so awful. It's so imprinted on my mind. And, when Nicola Sturgeon has been talking to anyone who listens about how awful it was for her to be under suspicion and how she's been exonerated, does she ever think how awful it was for Alec? She's not been charged with any offences. He was, and he was acquitted of all of them. But she's done her best to give the impression that he was guilty nonetheless. So, yeah, that was a very intense moment in my life. I have spent quite a lot of my life contributing to the struggle to make the prosecution of sexual crime more effective and make it less unpleasant for complainers. And so that's the position from which I approach all of this. But I believe that Alec was falsely accused. And I believe there was a reason for that. And I'm vindicated by his acquittal. And the disrespect that was shown to that verdict of acquittal, I find quite extraordinary. I'm not saying Alec was a saint. He shouldn't have been having a carry on with people he wasn't married to.
One other thing that I wanted to actually talk to you about again, which is another moment where you just think, how on earth, was the moment where the SNP, was she in the Chief Whip's office,
Oh, Anne
had,
Harvey. Yeah.
yes, talk about that, because that to me was quite astonishing as well. And to be clear, this was when he had the government inquiry had found him to have allegedly sexually harassed two women. So
And it was,
this was earlier.
yeah, it was leaked to a newspaper other than yours.
Yes.
Um, a lot of people were really shocked by it. So Anne Harvey, who became a very good friend of mine, had worked in the SNP Whip's office at Westminster in a senior position for many years. Anne's a lawyer to training, and she'd done some really good work over the years as a researcher and supporting SNP MPs in the Whip's office. Um, and she was going to there was the SNP were holding a National Assembly at Ayr Racecourse. Just a day or two after those headlines were all over the paper, she went up there and she was planning to have dinner with lots of other staffers from HQ, senior staff, party staffers. And she arrived at the hotel expecting to find people in the state of shock like she was about the charges against Alec. Instead, she found a very jovial atmosphere and people were having a good laugh about it all and talking about how they were going to melt down the bust of him in SNP HQ and what they would do with it. And she says she formed the opinion that the leak had not come as a surprise to these people and that many of them were glad to see Alex so accused. And of course, that fits in with what I say about the WhatsApp messages in
Mm-hmm.
in my book. Um,
How did how did that make you feel when she obviously told you that?
well, I mean, I was already a bit suspicious at the time. And later Anne said that later some of the people involved in that came down from HQ to Westminster, uh, ostensibly, well, as Anne said, to use Anne's words, suborning evidence against Alec, looking for people to complain. They didn't actually find anyone. Didn't find any complaints against Alec at Westminster, but they were told about my complaints and they ignored them. And I believe one or two other complaints against other people came up and they were just ignored because what I think what they were looking for was more ammunition to use against Alec.
And how did that make you feel as at that time an MP, obviously, and that was it was almost being celebrated?
I was afraid that my reputation would be destroyed. I was also afraid for my physical safety because I was constantly being threatened and there was no, and I'm not saying that the party are responsible for threats that come from out with the party, but when threats came from within the party, I would expect some support. And whenever Nicola was asked about the threats against me, she immediately turned the conversation into the threats that she received. But that's not the point. Lots of women receive threats. I was unique in receiving threats and not having any support from my party. Politics is stuffed full of professional politicians like Nicola who've never had a real job outside politics. And what they're interested in is being re-elected, constantly being re-elected and constantly keeping their position of power and well-paid job and influence and perks. Um, Politics should be about more than winning elections. It should be about what you do with the power you get when you win the election. And if you look back at the last 10 years, despite multiple stunning, in some cases, SNP victories, is Scotland a better place to live? I don't think so. Are we any closer to independence? Well, support has gone up, but we don't feel closer to it at all strategically. Did we get anything out of the Brexit crisis? No. And part of the reason I've written this book is so that we can learn from these failures. And I feel that I have been vindicated in lots of the things I brought up as problems: our lack of an independent strategy, our lack of a Brexit strategy, the problems of self ID, problems of governance within the party. I've been vindicated in all of those things. So I'm not just somebody with an axe to grind. I'm somebody who's setting out what happened so that it should be known and we should learn from it.
Um, do you think Nicola Sturgeon is to blame, or is others as well? And are those others still there?
Well, there's plenty of people to blame it. Nicola was the leader, but Peter Murrell created her leadership persona. Liz Lloyd was her chief of staff. She was surrounded by people who never challenged her and just went along with what she said. And that includes most of the MSPs and most of the MPs. So I don't blame it all on Nicola. It was a culture in the party. Very few people had the guts to question it. And, in fairness to them, they saw what happened to me when I did. So, you can understand why they would be scared of sticking their head above the parapet.